In today's episode, I have two interesting stories. In the first one, we'll talk about the Great Nicobar Megaproject, which got finally approved by the National Green Tribunal. And in the second one, we talk about India joining the Pax Silica movement. Hello and welcome to the Daily Brief Show by Zerodha, where our aim is to cut through the noise and bring you the biggest news in the financial markets in a way that's one level deeper as compared to other news channels. I'm your host, Kashish Kapoor. Today is 25th February, Wednesday. The southernmost point of India, lower even than Kanyakumari, is a tiny sliver of land at the very end of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. This is Great Nicobar, a pristine island fringed by coral reefs and blanketed in ancient tropical forest, closer to Indonesia than to mainland India. It is one of the most remote and undeveloped places in the country, home to around 8,000 people in the middle of nowhere. The Indian government wants to change that dramatically. It's putting together a giant mega project called the Holistic Development of Great Nicobar Island, which could turn the island's southernmost tip into a massive infrastructure hub. In all, the project will be spread across 166 square kilometers, just under a fifth of island's total area, and will cost upward of 81,000 crore rupees. Last week, the government got through one of the biggest hurdles in the project's path. A 6-member bench of the National Green Tribunal gave the project its blessing, citing its strategic and national importance. If its laundry list of conditions is met, construction can now begin. This legal approval, however, doesn't mean the project is uncontroversial. Many researchers consider it an environmental catastrophe in the making. Are they right? We are genuinely not sure. This is a story with major differences of opinion. Both sides have some basis in the truth. We don't know enough to tell you who is right, but we want to lay the facts as objectively as we can so that you know what the fuss is all about. At the southernmost tip of Great Nicobar Island, India wants to construct 4 separate pieces of infrastructures. A. An integrated infrastructure hub featuring a deep water transshipment port. B. A dual-use international airport. C. A gas and solar power plant. And D. A township scaled for 650,000 people. The plan's flagship is a deep water container transshipment port at the Galatea Bay on the island's southern coast. This will come together over the next 30 years in 4 phases. Even in its very first phase, it's planned to be a relatively large port with enough capacity to handle 4 million 20-foot equivalent units or TEUs. For a sense of how much that is, if all those containers were placed end to end, they would stretch halfway around the circumference of the Earth. Over time, this will be scaled to somewhere between 14 and 16 million TEUs, nearly twice the size of JNPT, India's largest port today, and in line with some of the biggest ports on the planet. The private sector will be brought in to build and manage this whole mammoth facility. Now, alongside the port, the government shall add an international airport with a 3,300-meter runway, long enough to handle major commercial aircrafts like the Airbus A380. At peak capacity, this will process 3,000 to 4,000 passengers every hour. The airport shall be dual-use apart from the regular flow of tourists and travelers. It will also run military operations. Because the runway is so long, it is essentially jut out into the sea at both ends, requiring land reclamation on either side. Then there's the supporting infrastructure. A 450 MVA gas and solar hybrid power plant will keep the whole project running, and a pair of townships spread across nearly 15,000 hectares will house the people needed to operate all of this. This is the most land-intensive part of the project. The island's population currently is around 8,000, and it would swell to over 6.5 lakh. Now, what's the point though? Why sacrifice a pristine island for just another port? Well, it won't be just another port. There is a structural gap in India's maritime logistics. Most major Indian ports require continuous capital-intensive dredging to accommodate ultra-large container vessels, the workhorses of modern global trade. Because the Indian ports often can't handle these ships directly, goods moving in and out of the country frequently require Transshipment. They travel first to a smaller Indian port, then get transferred to a larger hub, often abroad, in places like Colombo, Singapore, or Port Klang in Malaysia. That creates an automatic disadvantage for Indian products. Every container of Indian products costs an extra $80 to $300 in handling and spends an extra 3 days or so in transit. We also lose thousands of crores in port revenue to foreign competitors. The Galathea Bay does away with that problem. It has a natural draft depth exceeding 20 meters, deep enough for the largest vessels afloat without any dredging at all. But India already has a brand new deep water port that can handle the same traffic. Just last year, India inaugurated a new port facility in Kerala. That's a deep water port as well and sits just 10 miles away from the international east-west shipping lane. The Vizinjam port too was built with the same promise of relieving India's dependence on foreign ports. Then why build another 1600 kilometers away on a remote island? Well, because geographically there are a few points on the Indian Ocean with more strategic value. Great Nicobar sits right by the Malacca Strait, one of the world's busiest shipping lanes and the heart of the east-west international shipping route. This single narrow choke point handles roughly 30% of all internationally traded cargo, nearly 1 lakh ships every year. It links the world's biggest manufacturers, that's Japan, China, South Korea and Taiwan, to much of the rest of the world. A major port here wouldn't just attract transshipment traffic, it would sit at the doorstep of one of the most important trade corridors of the earth. In times of peace, this is an incredible location to have a logistics hub. But if there's ever a military confrontation, a large, well-equipped island right in the middle of one of the world's most strategic shipping lanes effectively lets you project power across the area. The world's greatest powers, that's China, the United States, and others, have all tried to establish a presence in the region. China, for instance, has a massive presence on the Coco Islands, just 55 kilometers to the south. The new port and airport give India a major foothold of its own. Now, to be fair, this is a costly project. The government plans to spend 81,000 crores over the next 30 years to bring it to life. Chances are we'll spend at least a few $1 billion more to bring the project alive. But the real cost, arguably, is environmental. Critics broadly have 3 complaints against the project: that it irreversibly destroys the island's natural habitat, that it ignores the human cost that will be borne by the island's tribes, and that it doesn't consider the risks of building in that area. The project takes land that is effectively carpeted with ancient pristine forest and clears roughly a sixth of it. Around 130 square kilometers of forest land will go into this project, at least 1 million trees. This forest is unlike any other on Earth. It is part of one of the world's most important biodiversity hotspots, home to species found nowhere else. 11 types of mammals, 32 types of birds, 7 types of reptiles, and 4 kinds of amphibians that only exist here. And that is only what we know. New species are still being discovered. No matter what one thinks about the trade-offs, the damage done to these species cannot be reversed. The region is also woven into the life cycles of animals that range far beyond the island. The leatherback turtle, for instance, depends on the Galathea Bay as one of its most important nesting sites in the Indian Ocean. Until 2021, in fact, the bay was a designated wildlife sanctuary for this very reason. Then in 2021, just as the port was coming up, it was denotified. It isn't clear how deeply these costs have been considered. Researchers argued that there have been serious lapses in how the project's environmental footprint was assessed. The primary biodiversity survey, for instance, was conducted over just 14 field days by a team of just 1 ecological expert. The forests of Great Nicobar are also home to some of India's smallest and most vulnerable communities, including the Shompen, a tribe of fewer than 300 people, which are among the most isolated people on the earth. Under the law, tribes like the Shompen have rights over the forest land they inhabit. Such projects can only proceed with their consent. The government claims to have done everything by the book, and that the project will have no bad impact on the lives of these tribes. Tribal leaders, however, allege that their consent was obtained under duress, with little understanding of what they were giving away. The Calcutta High Court will see whether legal process was properly followed next month. Now, legalities aside, however, it's hard to see how their lives will not be changed by a project of this scale. With over 500,000 people descending upon the island, these tiny communities will probably see their habitats altered and their culture placed under severe pressure. As these groups come into contact with outsiders, they could also be exposed to diseases against which they have no defense. Great Nicobar sits on one of India's most seismically active zones. The earthquake that triggered the devastating 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, which measured over 9 on the Richter scale, began just 130 kilometers from the island. What if we are ever to see a repeat? Now, to be fair, according to an IIT Kanpur study, events of this magnitude only occur once or twice a millennium. But any project built there remains exposed to earthquakes and tsunamis of a lesser but still damaging scale. This is not a problem shared by any of the established megaports the project hopes to compete with. All these costs are real and hard to deny. A mega project of this scale on a virgin island will definitely leave scars. It will change the ecology of the area and put many species with no other home in danger. It will also change the lives of the people who called the island home for hundreds of generations. Even with best practices followed throughout, this is a foregone conclusion. Now, some of it can be ameliorated. The environmental clearance granted to the project in 2022 stipulates various safeguards, from relocating corals away from the project site to measures for protecting specific animals to preserving mangroves and other vegetation. None of this will keep the island pristine, but if the conditions are followed along with the best practices that minimize habitat destruction, an ecological disaster can perhaps be averted. As things stand, though, these are promises, not outcomes. This isn't to take away from the fact that there's a real case for both a logistics hub and a military installation in the region. There are few better locations for one, but it's worth asking, can we actually bring the project to life? If the government's vision actually bears fruit, if Galathea Bay becomes an essential stop for international liner networks and a key gateway through which India trades with the world, perhaps these costs are justified. But there's a worst of all worlds possibility, one where forests are cleared and habitats are destroyed without creating any value. Mega projects, after all, fail most of the time. Even if the promised facilities do come up, itself a big if, there are no guarantee that the island actually draws commercial traffic. Shipping alliances might stick to the ports of Colombo and Singapore, while Vizinjam absorbs the bulk of domestic transshipment demand. In that case, Great Nicobar could become a white elephant, a tremendously expensive, heavily state-subsidized project with nothing to show for the price that was paid. Sadly, we won't know how it goes until the damage is already done. Now, on to the next story for the day. They say that the devil works hard, but the modern geopolitics works even harder. On February 6, India and US announced an interim trade deal. Washington would lower its punishing reciprocal tariffs on Indian goods from 50% to 18%. In return, India was required to slash duties on American industrial products and promised to cut Russian imports. A week later, on February 13, the White House released a revised fact sheet, quietly walking back on certain commitments. Then, in the last 4 days alone, the New World Order hit the throttle aggressively. India formally became a signatory to Pax Silica, a US-led coalition to secure the global supply chain for semiconductors and AI. Soon after, in a surprising turn of events, the US Supreme Court struck down President Trump's sweeping reciprocal tariffs. In response, Trump signed a proclamation imposing a flat 10% temporary import surcharge on all countries for 150 days, replacing the elaborate tariff regime that had been the entire basis for India's trade deal. Perhaps now, with the tariffs at 10% for everyone, India may have to re-evaluate the entire pact. That's why, by the next day, India had postponed planned trade talks with Washington. At the Daily Brief, we've mentally prepared ourselves to lose sleep over how world trade can change in a moment's notice. Arguably, it's unfolding faster than the leaps that LLMs are making today, and we keep falling behind on that alone. On that note, we are yet to cover Pax Silica. It's a monumental attempt to rewire the world's electronic industry. It doesn't exactly entail a set of steps to follow, nor is it binding, but it does tell us about how various countries, particularly the US, are thinking. The name here is deliberate. Pax is Latin for peace, stability, and long-term prosperity. The Roman Empire's golden age, for instance, was called Pax Romana. Perhaps the most famous such periods of stability is Pax Americana. It refers to the period after World War II, where the global order was firmly led by the US. The pillars of Pax Americana included economic openness and adherence to democratic values. This period was underwritten by military power, institutional stewardship, and the status of the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. In the same vein, Pax Silica is a bet on the next era of global power will be determined by who controls silicon and therefore semiconductors. After all, those who control the chips control AI. The initiative was launched at a summit in Washington in December 2025. 7 countries, the US, Japan, South Korea, the UK, Australia, Israel, and Singapore signed the founding declaration. The UAE and Qatar joined shortly after, and now India became the 10th signatory. Its stated aims are sweeping. Pax Silica wants to coordinate across the full stack of AI supply chain, critical minerals, energy inputs, semiconductor design and fabrication, advanced packaging, data centers, and so on. It seeks to reduce coercive dependencies on adversaries like China, which controls 90% of global rare earth refining and dominates legacy chip manufacturing. And it wants to protect the technological frontier, ensuring that aligned nations stay ahead. Pax Silica isn't entirely like Pax Americana. This isn't a coalition built on the principles of economic openness or efficiency. It's built on the explicit premise that national security and economic security are the same thing. In other words, with Pax Silica, the role of markets in allocating resources to semiconductor supply chain looks diminished, if not eliminated. Geopolitic necessity now trumps economic efficiency. This also ties in with the rest of the US's current hostile approach towards globalization. It is Trump's belief that economic openness is what hollowed out America's industry. So now, going forward, openness will be a lot more restrictive. One way to understand why Pax Silica exists is to look at who signed it. Each member controls a critical choke point in the semiconductor value chain. Starting from raw material, you have Australia, which has vast reserves of lithium and rare earths and is home to some of the world's largest mining companies. Japan, meanwhile, known for its electronic manufacturing, also has the capacity in key chemicals and manufacturing equipment. Then further down, you have most of the world's innovative companies. South Korea, for instance, is home to the world's biggest memory chip makers. Israel brings venture capital and innovation in software and cybersecurity. Singapore, meanwhile, is vital logistics hub and semiconductor packaging node. On the energy side, which AI needs a lot of, you have the oil-rich nations of Qatar and UAE. On the financing side, not only are there sovereign wealth funds of Singapore, the UAE, Qatar, but there's also venture capital machines of Israel and the UK. And lastly, you have the US, the linchpin of innovation, IP, and financing. Together, they represent an attempt to stitch together a coordinated, self-sustaining supply chain that doesn't depend on China for any critical input. But what's just as revealing as the list of signatories is who's excluded from it. See, the first Pax Silica summit in December had a wider guest list than its signatory list. Several important players attended the discussions but did not sign the declaration. The most striking absence, perhaps, is Taiwan. By any measure, Taiwan is the most important node in the global semiconductor supply chain. After all, TSMC fabricates most of the world's most advanced chips. Foxconn, headquartered in Taiwan, is the world's largest electronic contract manufacturer and now the biggest maker of AI servers. Without Taiwanese manufacturing, the entire AI revolution grinds to a halt. And yet Taiwan was designated only as a guest contributor at the Pax Silica summit, not a signatory. The reason is straightforwardly political. Most countries, including the US, do not officially recognize Taiwan as a sovereign nation state. Granting Taiwan full membership in the US-led strategic alliance would provoke a diplomatic crisis with China. Instead, the US has opted to integrate Taiwanese technology into the allied supply chain while carefully avoiding any formal acknowledgement of Taiwan as a country. It's a deliberate ambiguity. Taiwanese chips are essential to Pax Silica, but Taiwan itself cannot be a member. The another striking absence is the European Union here. Only individual European nations with specific choke points were brought into the fold. And even there, the picture is complicated. The Netherlands, for instance, is home to ASML, whose EUV machines are arguably the single most critical piece of equipment in advanced chipmaking. But while the Dutch attended the summit, they didn't sign the declaration. As per some analysts, there may be a divide and conquer logic at play here. The idea is that Washington prefers to deal with European countries bilaterally rather than with the EU as a unified entity. A fragmented Europe, from the US perspective, offers more room to maneuver, and ASML's technology can be secured directly to the Dutch government alone. It also doesn't help that increasingly the EU has found the US to be more unreliable. Our path to Pax Silica wasn't straightforward at all. In fact, we weren't even invited to the founding summit in December 2025. The initial exclusion might have two possible explanations. First, Pax Silica membership was structured around the existing choke points, countries that currently control a critical piece of the supply chain rather than future potential. India is pursuing its semiconductor ambitions by building new fabs and testing plants, but that's still mostly aspirational. Second, unresolved tariff disputes with the Trump administration may have made India's inclusion diplomatically awkward at the moment. Perhaps India chose to sit out of Pax Silica agreement until it got a better bargaining chip through a trade deal. So what changed? Besides the attractive size of India's AI market, we can't say for sure. But a few things may still stand out. The first could be enterprise AI. An interesting trend unfolding now is that to deploy AI at commercial scale, you might need system integrators or services companies that can help with deployment. That perhaps is why OpenAI has formed partnerships with Accenture and McKinsey, or why Anthropic got on Infosys as one of its largest customers. There has been a lot of chatter around how the very existence of Indian IT is threatened. However, the story so far has not been as neat. There's a possibility that with the bottlenecks that AI deployment will run into, IT services of some kind will be necessary. The second, more viable reason is India's depth in semiconductor design. India is home to nearly 20% of the world's chip design engineers. Nearly every top 25 fabless semiconductor company operates a major design center in India. Intel's largest design hub outside the US is in India. NVIDIA has between 4,000 and 10,000 Indian employees. To a small degree, the chips powering the Pax Silica coalition are, in many cases, already being designed in Bengaluru, Hyderabad, and Chennai, and that can't be done away with. The third is India's push to build physical choke points elsewhere in the value chain. Now, this has less to do with India's current advantages and more to do with building future leverage. Under the India Semiconductor Mission, India is building capacity to chip assembly and testing, advanced packaging, and even fabs. It's an attempt to move up the semiconductor value chain, which could build more bargaining power in future negotiations. Now, will Pax Silica succeed? That's not an easy question to answer, but let's look at where coordination could go wrong. In a sense, you can consider Pax Silica as an international scale industrial policy whose execution is underpinned by the US. There aren't subsidies involved, but there's an attempt to secure a supply chain and house it within certain borders only. And Pax Silica doesn't fully eliminate markets either. It just limits where they work. So the question can somewhat be boiled down to, where does industrial policy work? It works in curbing national security vulnerabilities like sanctions, blockades, or even war that can threaten industrial success. It works if you want to use tariffs to control export access. But where it doesn't work is cost. For instance, the IMF found that the friend shoring can lead to losses in GDP. By imposing geopolitical constraints and prioritizing trade only with trusted countries, supply chains become inherently less efficient. They impose trade costs and reduce the possibility of exploiting comparative advantages elsewhere. In fact, the US's own efforts to build semiconductor supply chains within the borders have run into financial excess. The Peterson Institute found that under the CHIPS Act, each job created cost twice the average salary of an American semiconductor worker. Plentiful was devoted to the program without considering cheaper, more efficient alternatives. Instead, the Peterson Institute argues the money could have been spent on stockpiling chips. If you've been listening to the Daily Brief story, you'll know that the Pax Silica story sounds very familiar. In certain cases, attempts to reverse globalization and pursue industrial policy doesn't always lead to reindustrializations. If anything, it often imposes cost on the host country and silos them for more efficient global supply chains. The US, or at least its consumers, is already bearing the cost of its own tariff. Now, frame these issues on a global scale. Pax Silica treats efficiency almost as a vulnerability. But the alternative of building a bloc that shuts out many other countries doesn't sound foolproof either. More importantly, Pax Silica doesn't have everyone, most notably Taiwan, on its side. There is a logic to Pax Silica, and it could succeed in its intended aims. However, there are allies of Pax Silica, and there are those that aren't a part of it. Inevitably, this will only fragment the world further. And as we've covered before, innovation in a world today is too globalized for a painless decoupling of supply chains. Finally, on to the tidbits for the day. The government has exempted recycling of mine tailings within existing leases from needing fresh environmental clearances. The move removes a key regulatory hurdle and allows companies to recover minerals and waters from waste more easily. It comes as India ramps up mining to support its energy transition goals. Second, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney will visit India from February 26 as a part of his Indo-Pacific tour. Talks will focus on trade, AI, energy, defense, and investment, with both sides targeting $50 billion in bilateral trade by 2030. Business partnerships and technology cooperation are expected to be key themes. And finally, Bharti Airtel will invest 20,000 crores over the next few years into its newly formed NBFC Airtel Money. The unit will focus on digital lending and credit distribution, building on Airtel's existing 9,000 crore loan disbursal engine. The move marks Airtel's big push into financial services beyond telecom. And that's it for today. We'll see you in the next one.
Disclaimer: this content is for informational purposes only. None of the stocks, brands, or products mentioned are recommendations or endorsements.